The power of missing buttons. For a decade, my friend, Jason, poured his soul into the boutique hotel and its high-end restaurant, a quaint but vibrant place nestled in the heart of our city. He was more than just the general manager, he was the lifeblood of the establishment. Late nights, endless weekends, and countless personal sacrifices were the norm for him, all in the name of keeping the place afloat. He dealt with every crisis, from staff shortages to unruly guests, and did so with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The owners, however, were blind to his dedication. They were the kind of old-money elite who believed their success was the result of some mythical acumen rather than the backs of people like Jason. As the years went by, it became painfully clear that the owner, Mr. Langford, was indifferent to the restaurant's true heartbeat, its people. His only concern was his bottom line, and Jason was constantly fighting a losing battle to retain good staff because Langford refused to pay them a living wage. As a result, the kitchen was a revolving door of talent, and Jason was left to pick up the pieces each time someone left. The final straw came with the sudden arrival of an ambitious young chef who Langford hired for a fraction of Jason's salary. Jason was blindsided. One day he was managing operations as usual, and the next, Langford was in his office, coldly informing him that his services were no longer required. They blamed Jason's dismissal on his supposedly lackadaisical attitude and claimed he had failed to arrive on time for several shifts, a half-truth twisted into a convenient lie. It was a ruthless betrayal after 10 years of loyalty, but Jason knew they had been hunting for someone cheaper for months, quietly undermining him while he worked tirelessly to keep the place running. They let him go on a Tuesday, effective immediately. No severance, no thank you, just a brisk clean out your office and leave. Jason walked out with a strained smile and a dark cloud of bitterness weighing on his shoulders. But what the management didn't realize was that they had made one critical oversight: they forgot to revoke his access to the hotel's point-of-sale (POS) system. It was a mundane mistake, but one that Jason would turn into a masterpiece of revenge. The next morning, with a half-finished coffee and a smirk tugging at his lips, Jason logged in from his laptop. One by one, he began deleting every button on the system. Every breakfast option, every signature cocktail, every obscure bottle of wine meticulously sourced from obscure European vineyards, it all vanished with a few deft keystrokes. It was like watching a complex structure disassemble itself piece by piece, and Jason reveled in the silent, digital destruction. For Jason, it was less about revenge and more about reclamation. He couldn't undo the years of unappreciated effort, but for one glorious moment, he was in control. By noon, the restaurant was in chaos. Customers were left waiting as staff frantically tried to ring up orders on a system that no longer recognized a single menu item. The new manager, still wet behind the ears and already overwhelmed, was drowning in angry phone calls and complaints. By early afternoon, Jason had 17 missed calls from Langford and his cronies, each more frantic than the last. It was a catastrophic day for the hotel. Word got out quickly, and a local influencer tweeted a picture of a server scribbling down orders on a napkin, the caption reading, "High-end dining?" More like high-end disaster. They had no choice but to shut down the entire operation for the day to rebuild the system from scratch, costing them thousands in lost revenue and tarnishing their fragile reputation. Our friend group was divided. Some hailed Jason as a hero, applauding him for giving the arrogant owners a taste of their own medicine. Others thought it was a petty act, an unnecessary burning of bridges that would only haunt him in the future. As for Jason, he never said much about that day, except to note the quiet satisfaction he felt as he watched their world briefly unravel. Was it too much? He'd ask, feigning uncertainty as he nursed his drink. But the sly grin that lingered on his face told us all we needed to know. Jason knew it was petty. He also knew it was perfect. In the end, maybe it wasn't about the missing buttons. Maybe it was about all the unseen things that had gone missing over the years: respect, gratitude, and any semblance of decency. Those things were long gone, just like the buttons that had once defined a menu. Jason had simply given them a taste of the emptiness they had forced him to swallow for a decade. And for that one day, as the power dynamics flipped, it was enough. The days that followed Jason's digital sabotage rippled through the hotel like a seismic shockwave, unraveling the polished facade Langford had worked so hard to maintain. The restaurant's reputation, once a beacon of exclusivity, now lay in tatters, besieged by social media outrage and the humiliating stories circulating among the city's elite. Staff members, caught in the crossfire of Jason's wrath and Langford's incompetence, whispered about the calamity that had turned their workplace into a circus. The hotel's new manager, Bryce, young, eager, and hopelessly out of his depth, spent his first week frantically trying to recover what Jason had erased. Bryce was the perfect pawn, naive, hungry for validation, and willing to work for a pittance. But under the pressure, his enthusiasm quickly turned to despair. He was expected to restore order with no guidance and no clear understanding of the hotel's complex operations. Each day he faced the brunt of misplaced anger from furious guests and disgruntled staff who saw him as a symbol of the hotel's unraveling. Langford, too, was feeling the heat. Normally elusive, he was now forced to oversee every detail of the recovery process, shouting orders that did little more than add to the confusion. The calm, detached businessman who had once sneered at Jason's long hours was now a visibly unraveling figure, his usual smugness replaced by stress-induced paranoia. He could be found hovering over Bryce's shoulder, barking at him to fix the mess as though it were a simple inconvenience rather than a full-scale disaster. Each time a system reboot failed or an order was lost, it was another crack in Langford's carefully constructed image of control. And then came the inevitable, a VIP reservation gone horribly wrong. The hotel was hosting a high-profile charity gala, an event that promised both prestige and substantial revenue. This was Langford's chance to salvage his bruised reputation, but the restaurant's ongoing tech issues turned the night into a farce. Orders disappeared, drinks never arrived, and the swanky hors d'oeuvres that were supposed to impress the city's upper crust were served cold or not at all. A wealthy donor's wife was accidentally served a cocktail that was supposed to be alcohol-free, a serious error given her well-known recovery status. Langford was forced to make a public apology, his face flushed red as he tried to smooth over the PR disaster with charm that rang hollow. Meanwhile, Jason watched from the sidelines, both satisfied and a little stunned by the depth of the chaos he'd caused. He had expected to inconvenience them, to deliver a small, pointed message. But this was a spectacular implosion that had gone far beyond his wildest imaginings. Still, his private victory was bittersweet. Free from the hotel's demands, Jason suddenly found himself facing the vast emptiness of his own life. He had sacrificed everything, friendships, relationships, even his health, for a career that had chewed him up and spit him out. Late at night, sitting in his tiny apartment surrounded by the relics of his former life, awards, framed newspaper clippings, old menus he had curated with care, Jason couldn't help but feel the sting of it all. Was he really free, or just adrift? And then there was the phone call. It came late one evening from an unknown number. Jason hesitated, assuming it was just another panicked attempt from Langford or Bryce, but something told him to answer. On the other end was Claudia, the hotel's former sommelier, who had left months before, disgusted by the stagnant wages and Langford's indifference. She had been one of Jason's closest allies, and they shared a history of midnight conversations over shared bottles of obscure wines and plans of opening their own place someday, a fantasy neither had ever truly believed would happen. But this call was different. Claudia had landed on her feet, joining forces with a prominent investor who was looking to open a new restaurant. And she wanted Jason. Not as an employee, but as a partner. A chance to build something new from the ground up, with a team that valued experience and vision over profit margins. "It's your time," she said, her voice tinged with the kind of excitement Jason hadn't heard in years. "We'll do it right. No Langfords, no shortcuts. Just us." Jason sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, a shot at redemption that came with a hefty dose of risk. But then again, hadn't he already lost everything once? Perhaps this time, the fall wouldn't be so hard. That night, Jason poured himself a glass of the good stuff, the kind of wine he used to save for special occasions that never quite came. He raised it to the empty room, a silent toast to all the buttons that had been pressed, deleted, and restored, to the power plays and the fallout, and to the unforeseen twists that make life bearable, if not always beautiful. By the next morning, Jason was on board, ready to take the plunge. Langford would go on to rebuild his empire, Bryce would learn hard lessons about ambition, and the hotel would recover in time. But Jason had moved on, propelled by the promise of something more than just a paycheck. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking back. But Claudia's offer wasn't the only surprise that night. As Jason sat with his wine, savoring the promise of a new beginning, his phone buzzed again, this time an anonymous message with a video attached. He hesitated, then opened it. The grainy footage revealed a private meeting in Langford's office, recorded by a hidden camera. In the video, Langford and Bryce were deep in conversation, their voices low and conspiratorial. "So, what's the deal with Jason?" Bryce asked, shifting nervously. "We could have just demoted him, kept him on board." Langford smirked, swirling the ice in his glass. "Jason's a relic. He knows too much, asks for too much, and frankly, I'm tired of dealing with his self-righteous crap. He's not just expensive, he's a liability. We found someone cheap, someone who doesn't question every damn decision we make. You understand, right? This is business." Jason's chest tightened as he watched. Bryce nodded, a reluctant acceptance in his eyes. "Sure, but what about the accusation of him not showing up on time?" Langford chuckled, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Didn't matter if it was true. We needed an excuse to cut him loose, and that was enough. He gave us 10 years, but I'm not running a charity. We move on." The video cut off, but its implications hung heavy in the room. Jason set his glass down, his hand trembling with a mix of fury and vindication. The truth was laid bare, his dismissal had never been about performance, punctuality, or anything else but a cold, calculated betrayal by a man who saw loyalty as weakness. Jason's first instinct was to send the video to everyone, to the press, to Langford's investors, to anyone who would listen. He could destroy Langford's reputation in an instant, exposing him for the ruthless fraud he was. But as his finger hovered over the send button, a different thought took hold. This was Langford's playbook: leverage, manipulation, and public humiliation. To play that game would be to sink to his level, and after everything, Jason had no intention of becoming a different version of the man who had discarded him. Instead, Jason saved the video as a quiet reminder of why he'd walked away. Langford's downfall would come eventually, men like him always collapsed under the weight of their own ego. And when it did, Jason wouldn't need to lift a finger. He forwarded the video to Claudia with a simple message: "Let's build something better." The following morning, Jason met Claudia at a vacant space downtown. It was raw and unfinished, but Jason saw potential in every bare wall and unpolished floorboard. It was theirs for the taking, an empty canvas on which they could write their own story. As he stood there, envisioning the bustling kitchen, the lively bar, and the energy of a place that valued its people, Jason felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of hope. He and Claudia would do things differently: fair pay, creative freedom, and a team that was more like family than employees. It wouldn't be easy, but Jason was ready to start again, wiser and unburdened by the weight of his past. The world would forget about the missing buttons, the chaos, and the failed galas. But Jason knew the real victory wasn't in the chaos he left behind, it was in the new beginning he had found amid the ruins. That night, as they sat among blueprints and wine glasses, Claudia raised her glass in a toast. "To the future," she said, smiling. "To never looking back." Jason clinked his glass against hers, feeling the first flicker of peace he'd known in years. "To building something that lasts," he replied. And for the first time, he truly meant it. As they sketched out their plans, the empty space around them felt less like a risk and more like a promise, a place where every missing piece could finally find its place.